In November 2012, police in Zhuzhou, China, raided a quiet apartment, expecting to bust a local drug ring. Instead, they stumbled into a scene from a nightmare. Blood stained the floors, human remains were scattered in bags, and on the stove, a pot was boiling. What began as a desperate search for a missing businesswoman had uncovered a crime of unimaginable depravity. Before we step into this house of horrors, please consider subscribing to support our investigations. On a seemingly ordinary day in November 2012, the atmosphere inside the Guihua police station in Zhuzhou City, Hunan Province, was routine. Officers sifted through paperwork, the hum of the heater battling the autumn chill outside. But that calm was shattered when a man burst through the precinct doors, his face pale and his breathing ragged. He looked like a man who had been running not just from a physical threat, but from a terrifying realization. The man, identified as Mr. Hu, was in a state of extreme distress. He told the officer at the desk that his wife, Liu Ying, had vanished. She had been unreachable for 2 days. The family had spent the previous 48 hours combing the streets, calling hospitals, and contacting friends, but every lead had turned into a dead end. Exhausted and out of options, Mr. Hu was now begging for official intervention. According to his statement, the timeline of the disappearance began on November 19th, 2012. Around 4 p.m. that afternoon, Mr. Hu had called his wife. Her phone rang and rang, echoing into the void, but nobody picked up. At first, he assumed she was busy with work or driving, but as the hours ticked by and the sun began to set over Zhuzhou, a knot of dread formed in his stomach. It was unlike her to be out of contact for so long. Driven by instinct, Mr. Hu drove to the company where Liu Ying worked. He hoped to find her at her desk, perhaps laughing about a dead battery or a silent ringer. Instead, her colleagues delivered worrying news. Liu Ying had left the office hours ago in the middle of the afternoon. She had not mentioned where she was going or whom she was meeting. Panic began to set in. Mr. Hu immediately contacted Liu Ying's older sister and her brother-in-law. The three of them formed a frantic search party, checking every location. Liu Ying was known to frequent her favorite restaurants, the local markets, the homes of close friends. But the city of Zhuzhou, usually so familiar, suddenly felt vast and indifferent. There was no trace of her. The initial theory among the family was a medical emergency. Perhaps she had been struck by a car or collapsed from a sudden illness. They expanded their search to the emergency rooms and morgues of the district. They braced themselves to identify a body or find her unconscious in a hospital bed. But the doctors and nurses shook their heads. There had been no admission of a Jane Doe matching Liu Ying's description, nor were there any unidentified bodies brought in that evening. It was not until the dead of night that the silence was broken, but not in the way the family had hoped. The brother-in-law's phone buzzed with a text message. He looked at the screen and froze. The sender ID was Liu Ying. The message was brief, but its contents sent a chill through the family. However, it was not just the words that were alarming. It was the context. The phone number the brother-in-law was currently using had previously belonged to Liu Ying's older sister. It had been transferred to him some time ago. Liu Ying knew this. She knew exactly who held that phone. Yet, the text message began with a strange salutation. To my older sister, the text read, "I have some urgent business to attend to. I will be away for a while. Do not worry." The family stared at the glowing screen. Why would she address her brother-in-law as her sister? Why would she send a text instead of calling, especially after being missing for hours? And why was the tone so stiff, so formal? It did not sound like Liu Ying. To the terrified family, this screamed of a scenario they had seen on television crime dramas, a kidnapping. It felt like a message typed under duress, or perhaps typed by someone else entirely, using her phone to buy time. Mr. Hu then provided the police with another piece of disturbing evidence. Liu Ying commuted daily using her personal vehicle. She drove everywhere. Yet, when the family checked her workplace, they found her car still parked in its usual spot in the lot. This detail was the smoking gun. Liu Ying might leave town for business, but she would never leave on foot while abandoning her car at the office. If she had left voluntarily, the car would be gone. The fact that the vehicle remained while the driver had vanished suggested she had been intercepted, taken against her will, before she could even turn the key in the ignition. Detectives at the Guihua police station began to piece together the disparate clues. A missing woman, a car left behind, a suspicious text message sent to the wrong relative. The pieces pointed toward an abduction. However, the kidnapping theory had a major flaw. If this were a kidnapping for ransom, the perpetrators would have made contact by now. Kidnappers do not take a hostage to remain silent. They want money. Hours had turned into days, and the phone remained silent regarding any demands for cash. If it was not a kidnapping for ransom, the detectives had to consider a darker possibility: a robbery gone wrong, or a murder by someone she knew. The police launched a dual-track investigation. While one team focused on tracing the digital footprint of the mysterious text message, another team began digging into Liu Ying's personal life. To find out what happened to her, they needed to understand who she was. As investigators interviewed colleagues and social acquaintances, a portrait of Liu Ying emerged. She was a woman who lived loudly. She was not involved in any known feuds or deep-seated grudges, but she was a polarizing figure. She was wealthy, and she enjoyed flaunting it. She wore expensive jewelry, drove a nice car, and was known in the local social circles as someone who was willing to spend big. But there were whispers. Rumors circulated that Liu Ying had been getting close to other men recently, drifting outside the boundaries of her marriage. The investigation quickly zeroed in on two specific men who had been seen with her. The first was James Zhang, a wealthy Chinese-American expatriate. He was known in the local underworld as a heavy hitter, a man with resources and a reputation. The second man was Chen Kailing, a middle-aged man from Chaozhou. Neighbors and witnesses reported seeing Liu Ying frequently in the company of these two men. They were often seen returning to her vicinity late at night, their behavior secretive and suspicious. Mr. Hu, when pressed by police about these men, admitted he knew of them. He told detectives that when he had confronted his wife about her late nights, she had dismissed his concerns. She claimed they were simply business partners, connections she needed to maintain for a lucrative deal she was working on. She had warned her husband not to interfere, fearing that a domestic dispute might cost her a massive financial opportunity. Mr. Hu, trusting his wife's business acumen, had let it go. Now, he regretted that decision. Police decided these business partners needed to be brought in for questioning immediately. Tracking down James Zhang proved difficult. He was a man who moved between borders. Detectives discovered he had recently flown back to the United States. They had to wait 2 tense days for his return. As soon as his flight touched down on Chinese soil, officers were waiting. He was escorted from the airport directly to the interrogation room. James Zhang was calm. He admitted to knowing Liu Ying for over 6 months. He described their relationship as one of mutual interest in the high-stakes world of gambling. Liu Ying, he explained, was a player. She had money, and she had the nerve to lose it. He enjoyed her company because she was generous and fun, a perfect companion for the casinos. However, when detectives pressed him on his whereabouts for November 19th, Zhang produced a passport and flight records. At the time Liu Ying vanished, James Zhang was thousands of miles away on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. He had been in the United States for 3 weeks prior to her disappearance. His alibi was ironclad. He was physically incapable of committing the crime. Detectives crossed James Zhang off the list and turned their attention to the second man, Chen Kailing. Chen was a more slippery target. A background check revealed why he was so low profile. He was a fugitive on the run from loan sharks. He had fled his hometown to escape gambling debts and had drifted into Zhuzhou, living off the grid. Investigators learned that Chen and Liu Ying had met by chance on the street. According to witnesses, Chen had intervened when he saw street thieves trying to snatch Liu Ying's handbag. He had saved her property, and in gratitude, Liu Ying had taken him under her wing. She became his benefactor. Whenever they met, she would pay for his meals and give him cash for daily expenses. Chen had told associates that Liu Ying was his savior, the woman who was helping him get back on his feet and pay off his debts. But detectives knew that help in the underworld often came with strings attached. Further probing revealed that Liu Ying's assistance was not entirely altruistic. She had introduced Chen to the local underground gambling scene. She was feeding the very addiction that had ruined him in the first place. Had the relationship soured? Had the desperate debtor turned on his benefactor for quick cash? Police tracked Chen Kai-liang down and brought him in. He was a nervous wreck, but not because of murder. He was terrified the loan sharks had found him. Regarding Liu Ying, he was adamant. He claimed he had no reason to hurt her. She was his golden goose, his only source of income in a city where he was a hunted man. Killing her would be killing his lifeline. More importantly, witnesses placed Chen Kai-liang deep inside a gambling den on the day of the disappearance. He had been at the tables all day and night, surrounded by dozens of fellow gamblers who could vouch for his presence. The timeline simply did not work. Chen Kai-liang, like James Zhang, had a solid alibi. The investigation hit a wall. Both primary suspects, the wealthy lover and the desperate debtor, were innocent. The police had to reset the board. If it was not a crime of passion or a debt dispute, then what was it? They had to look at the victim again. Liu Ying was a woman who flashed her wealth. She wore gold, she carried cash, she drove a car. In a city of millions, she was a walking target. Detectives decided to abandon the relationship angle and focus on the geography of the crime. They returned to the last known location where Liu Ying might have been seen. They began the laborious task of pulling surveillance footage from every camera in the vicinity of her workplace and the routes she frequented. Hours of grainy footage spooled by. Officers stared at screens until their eyes burned, looking for a glimpse of her face or her car. Finally, a breakthrough. On a camera monitoring Hongqi Square, located on Xinhua Road, they spotted her. The timestamp confirmed it was shortly after she had left her office. Liu Ying was standing in the square. She was not alone. Standing with her were two men. They were not James Zhang or Chen Kai-liang. These were two strangers. The body language in the video was striking. This was not an abduction in the traditional sense. There was no struggle, no gun pressed to her back. The three of them were talking. At one point, they were seen smiling and laughing. It looked like a meeting between friends. After a short conversation, Liu Ying walked off with the two men, appearing completely at ease. Detectives brought Mr. Hu in to view the footage. He squinted at the screen, desperation in his eyes, hoping to recognize a cousin, a client, anyone. He shook his head. He had never seen these men before in his life. He was baffled. His wife, who he thought he knew, seemed to have an entirely secret social circle. Who were these men, and why did she look so happy to see them just moments before she vanished from the face of the earth? The investigation shifted gears. The focus was now entirely on identifying these two mystery men. But the footage was grainy, and facial recognition technology in 2012 was not what it is today. No one in the precinct recognized them. They had no names, no addresses, and no vehicle license plates. The only lead the police had was behavioral. The men were seen loitering in Hongqi Square, a hub for local entertainment and notably underground gambling. Given Liu Ying's penchant for mahjong and cards, it was highly probable that she had met these men at the tables. The police formulated a new strategy. If these men were gamblers, they would return to the tables. Addicts rarely stay away for long. The Zhuzhou police launched a massive undercover operation. They could not go in with uniforms and sirens, or the suspects would scatter like cockroaches. Instead, they sent plainclothes detectives into the gambling dens, mahjong parlors, and tea houses surrounding Hongqi Square. The officers posed as addicts, chain-smoking cigarettes and slapping tiles onto the tables, all while scanning the room for the faces from the grainy CCTV footage. It was a waiting game. Days passed. The smoke-filled rooms of the gambling underground were opaque and hostile to outsiders, but the detectives were patient. Then, a stroke of luck, in a small, crowded mahjong parlor, a detective spotted them. 2 men, matching the physical build and facial features of the suspects in the video, walked in. They sat down and began to play. The undercover officer watched them closely. They played aggressively. They threw money around with a carelessness that suggested they had recently come into a significant windfall. This was suspicious. Regular, low-level gamblers usually nursed their chips. These men were playing like they had money to burn. The detective signaled his team. They did not make an arrest immediately. They needed to know where these men lived. If they had killed Liu Ying, the evidence, or perhaps even the victim herself, would be at their residence. When the 2 men cashed out and left the parlor, a team of plainclothes officers trailed them. They moved through the dark streets of Zhuzhou, keeping a safe distance. The suspects led them to a residential complex in a quiet part of the city. They entered an apartment building and took the elevator up. The police had their den. The next morning, the command came down to execute the raid. A tactical team of over a dozen officers surrounded the apartment building. They blocked the exits, covered the stairwells, and secured the perimeter. They were prepared for anything: a hostage situation, a shootout, or a desperate flee attempt. As the team moved into the lobby, the elevator doors pinged open. By sheer coincidence, the 2 suspects were stepping out. They were dragging large, heavy suitcases behind them. They looked like men in a hurry, men preparing for a long trip. They were attempting to flee. The moment the suspects saw the group of grim-faced men approaching, instinct took over. They knew instantly that these were not neighbors. Panic flared in their eyes. They dropped the suitcases and bolted. "Police! Freeze!" the officers shouted, their voices echoing off the tiled walls. The suspects ignored the command. They scrambled toward the stairwell, desperate to put distance between themselves and the law. But the police had done their homework. Every exit was blocked. The suspects were trapped in the lobby. Seeing the ground exit sealed, one of the men, in a frenzy of adrenaline, pulled a knife from his waistband. He lunged toward a woman standing near the elevators, intending to take a hostage to force his way out. It was a fatal miscalculation. The woman was not a helpless bystander. She was a plainclothes officer, highly trained in close-quarters combat. As the suspect lunged, she didn't flinch. She sidestepped the blade and delivered a crushing kick directly to his groin. The man crumpled to the floor, howling in agony, the knife clattering away across the tiles. The second suspect, seeing his partner drop, realized fighting was futile. But panic makes people do irrational things. He turned and ran toward the stairs, heading up. He raced toward the roof. Officers pursued him, boots thundering on the concrete steps. He burst onto the rooftop, wind whipping at his face. He ran to the edge and looked over. He was contemplating jumping to the adjacent building, a stunt that looked possible in movies, but was suicidal in reality. The gap was too wide. A fall meant certain death. Behind him, the police burst through the roof access door. An officer drew his service weapon and fired a warning shot into the sky. Bang! The sound cracked through the air, freezing the suspect in his tracks. He looked at the impossible jump, then back at the smoking gun barrel. The fight drained out of him. He slowly sank to his knees, raising his hands in surrender. The 2 men were handcuffed and dragged back down to the lobby, but the investigation was not over. The police needed to see what was inside the apartment they had been fleeing from. They dragged the suspects back to their unit and kicked the door open. The smell hit them first. It was a thick, metallic stench that made the officers gag. It was the undeniable odor of death, mingled with something else, something cooking. The police stepped inside, guns drawn, scanning the room. The apartment was a slaughterhouse. Blood spatter marred the walls. Dark, sticky pools had soaked into the floorboards. But it was what was on the floor that made even the most hardened veterans recoil. Scattered across the living room were pieces of flesh, not whole bodies, but fragments. Small, unrecognizable chunks of meat lay in heaps. And then, an officer walked into the kitchen. The stove was on. A large pot was sitting on the burner, the liquid inside bubbling. The officer approached the pot and peered inside. Floating in the boiling water were not animal parts. They looked disturbingly like human internal organs. The detectives realized with horror that the trip the suspects were packing for was likely a disposal run, and the meal on the stove suggested a level of depravity that went beyond simple murder. They had found Liu Ying, or at least what was left of her. The scene inside the apartment was a tableau of absolute horror, a grim reality that silenced even the most seasoned officers on the squad. While the two suspects were dragged away in handcuffs, a specialized forensic team moved in to process the carnage. The air was heavy with the copper scent of blood, mixed with the savory, incongruous aroma of spices, star anise, cinnamon, and meat. The apartment was not just a crime scene. It was a makeshift abattoir. Bloodstains had been hastily wiped from the walls, but still lurked in the crevices of the floorboards. On the kitchen counter, investigators found piles of minced meat, carefully chopped and separated from bone. But the true nightmare lay simmering on the stove. The large pot was still bubbling. Inside, investigators found what looked undeniably like human internal organs and strips of flesh stewing in a dark, seasoned broth. The killers had not just dismembered their victim, they were cooking her. The psychological impact on the first responders was immediate and severe. Several officers had to step out of the room to retch, overwhelmed by the grotesque mixture of domestic cooking smells and the undeniable reality of a butchered human being, while the forensic team began the grim task of collecting and cataloging the biological evidence. The two suspects, Li Xiao and Li Shuigao, were transported to the interrogation rooms at the police headquarters. The detectives knew they had the killers, but they needed a confession. They needed to know the why, and, crucially, they needed to confirm the identity of the remains in the pot to be 100% certain it was the missing Liu Ying. The interrogation began with a strategy of isolation. Li Xiao and Liu Shuigao were placed in separate rooms, unaware of what the other was saying. This prisoner's dilemma was the detective's best tool. When detectives asked Liu Shuigao about the meat found in his apartment, his answer was chillingly mundane. With a straight face, he claimed that the flesh scattered around the kitchen and boiling on the stove was pork. He told the investigators that he and his friend were preparing a large batch of filling for steamed buns, a common staple in Chinese cuisine. He spoke with the casual demeanor of a home cook interrupted in the middle of a recipe, utterly denying that the meat was anything other than livestock bought from a market. The detectives then pivoted to the second damning piece of evidence: the suitcases and their attempt to flee. "If you were just cooking dinner," one detective asked, leaning across the metal table, "why did you run the moment you saw us? Why were you packed for a long trip?" Liu Shuigao shrugged. He claimed they were simply going on a vacation, a spontaneous trip to see some sights. He insisted that running from the police was just a misunderstanding, a panic reaction because he thought they were being robbed. However, in the adjacent interrogation room, Li Xiao was telling a different story. When asked why they ran, Li Xiao claimed that he was terrified because he had been dabbling in drug trafficking. He told police he thought the raid was a narcotics bust, and he ran to avoid being caught with a small amount of contraband. The discrepancies were glaring. One said vacation, the other said escaping a drug charge. One said pork for buns, the other remained silent and sullen. The lies were uncoordinated, crumbling under the slightest pressure. The detectives pressed harder, using the inconsistencies as a wedge. They returned to Liu Shuigao and pointed out that his partner had already cracked, that the story about the vacation had been exposed as a lie. They told him that forensic testing on the meat would be concluded within the hour, and once DNA proved it was human, there would be no deals, no leniency. The final blow to their defense came when the preliminary forensic report arrived. The medical examiner confirmed that the tissue samples taken from the kitchen were human. Specifically, they matched the biological profile of Liu Ying. Confronted with the scientific irrefutable truth, the facade of the two men collapsed. The arrogance drained from their faces, replaced by the resignation of men who knew their lives were effectively over. After hours of circular denials, they stopped fighting. Li Xiao and Liu Shuigao began to talk, narrating a tale of greed, envy, and cold-blooded cruelty that had been weeks in the making. To understand the brutality of the crime, the police first had to understand the men who committed it. Li Xiao was a native of Zhuzhou, Hunan province. His life had been derailed early. In October of 1997, while still a young man, he had been convicted of theft and sentenced to 15 years in prison. 15 years is a lifetime in the criminal justice system. But Li Xiao had been a model prisoner. He kept his head down, followed the rules, and was granted early release for good behavior. He walked out of the prison gates, hoping for a fresh start. Liu Shuigao, 48 years old, and also from Zhuzhou, had a more violent streak. He had served a 4-year sentence in the past, but the correctional system had done little to correct him. Shortly after his first release, he was arrested again, this time for intentional injury assault. He was a man prone to solving problems with his fists. Both men had eventually completed their sentences and returned to society, carrying the heavy stigma of being ex-convicts. In China, reintegration for former prisoners can be exceptionally difficult. The hukou household registration system and strict employment background checks often make it nearly impossible for men with criminal records to find legitimate, well-paying work. Initially, both Li and Liu harbored a desire to be normal citizens. They wanted to work, to earn a living, to leave the gray walls of the prison behind them. But reality was harsh. Employers looked at their files and turned them away. They were relegated to the margins of society, working odd jobs for scraps, feeling the weight of judgment from their neighbors and families. The two men met by chance while wandering the streets of Zhuzhou, two drifters with nothing to do and nowhere to be. They bonded over their shared history of incarceration and their shared resentment of a society that would not let them in. But instead of supporting each other and finding a legitimate path, they became enablers of their worst vices. Unemployed and bored, they turned to gambling. It was a way to kill time and a desperate, foolish hope to strike it rich. But gambling requires capital, and they had none. As their debts mounted and their pockets emptied, the resolve to stay straight evaporated. They decided that if society saw them as criminals, they might as well act the part. They formed a partnership. Li Xiao, the thief, and Liu Shuigao, the thug. Their initial plan was simple robbery. They targeted the underground gambling dens they frequented, looking for winners who were flush with cash. They figured that gamblers carrying illicit winnings would be less likely to go to the police. To execute their plan, they developed a wolf in sheep's clothing tactic. They would enter the casinos, pose as players, and befriend potential targets. They would laugh with them, smoke with them, and gain their trust. Then, under the cover of darkness, they would trail them home and rob them. Their first target had been a wealthy overseas Chinese man. They had stalked him for days, planning to ambush him. However, the plan was a disaster. The target was tougher than he looked, or perhaps had protection. The robbery was botched, and instead of getting money, Li and Liu were beaten severely and chased off. Humiliated and battered, but not deterred, they changed their criteria. They decided that men were too dangerous. They needed softer targets. They shifted their focus to women specifically, women who displayed their wealth openly and moved alone at night. That was when they noticed Liu Ying. In the ecosystem of the Zhuzhou gambling underground, Liu Ying was a peacock. She was famous for her husband's success in the seafood business. Everyone knew the couple had money. After working days at her company, she would arrive at the mahjong parlors, dripping in gold jewelry, carrying stacks of cash, and driving a luxury car. To Li Xiao and Li Shuigao, she was not a person. She was a walking ATM. The jewelry she wore became their obsession. They watched the way the gold bracelets glinted under the fluorescent lights of the mahjong tables. They calculated the value of her earrings. They estimated the cash in her purse. They began to stalk her, learning her routine, her hours, and her weaknesses. They knew she loved to gamble, and they knew she was a social creature. They approached her at the tables, playing the role of friendly, slightly hapless fellow gamblers. They flattered her, deferred to her, and slowly ingratiated themselves into her circle. Liu Ying, unsuspecting and generally open-hearted with her gambling acquaintances, let her guard down. She saw them as harmless friends. By mid-November, the trap was ready. On November 19, 2012, Li Xiao and Li Shuigao contacted Liu Ying with a proposition. They told her they were looking to buy a house in the area but needed a savvy second opinion. They flattered her business sense, asking if she could come with them to look at a property near Hongqi Square. They begged her, playing on her helpful nature and their established friendship. Liu Ying agreed. She had no reason to suspect that these two men, whom she had played cards with, were plotting her death. She met them at Hongqi Square, the meeting captured on the CCTV footage that would later lead police to the killers. She parked her car at her office, thinking she would be back in an hour or two. She got into a vehicle with them, or perhaps walked with them, to the apartment they were renting, the apartment that belonged to Liu Shuigao. The moment she stepped across the threshold of the apartment, the trap snapped shut. The two men dropped the act immediately. As Li Ying walked into the bedroom to inspect the property, they pounced. They threw a heavy black plastic bag over her head, blinding her and cutting off her air supply. Before she could scream, they tackled her onto the bed. Liu Shuigao, the muscle, pinned her down, while Li Xiao secured her wrists and ankles with thick rope they had prepared days in advance. To silence her muffled cries, they wrapped heavy-duty tape around her head, sealing her mouth. The robbery began. They ripped her purse from her shoulder and dumped the contents onto the floor. Inside, they found 8,800 yuan, roughly 1,400 United States dollars at the time, along with 200 Hong Kong dollars, some bank checks, and a debit card. It was a decent haul for two desperate addicts, but it was not enough. They turned their attention to the gold. They stripped the heavy gold necklace from her neck, pulled the bracelets from her wrists, and removed her earrings. Still, their greed was insatiable. They held a knife to her throat, the cold steel pressing against the plastic bag over her head. They demanded she sign the checks and reveal the PIN for her bank card. Terrified and bound, Liu Ying wept. She managed to communicate a desperate truth. There was no more money. She told them that the bank account linked to the card was empty, that her wealth was tied up in the business and physical assets. She begged them to check the balance if they did not believe her. She pleaded for her life, offering them whatever she had on her person if they would just let her go. The killers paused. They realized she was likely telling the truth, or at least that accessing more money would be difficult and risky. At that moment, a dark calculation took place. Liu Ying had seen their faces. She knew who they were. If they let her go, she would go straight to the police. She had ceased to be a source of profit and had become a liability. The transition from robbery to murder was instant and brutal. Li Xiao and Li Shuigao picked up a hammer they had prepared. Without a word of mercy, they swung the heavy tool down onto her head. The blows were massive and fatal. Liu Ying collapsed onto the bed, blood pooling around her, her life extinguished in a dirty apartment by two men she thought were friends. The room fell silent, save for the heavy breathing of the killers. But the horror was only beginning. Now, they had a body to get rid of. An adult human body is heavy, difficult to move, and conspicuous. They could not simply carry her out the front door in a suitcase without raising suspicion. Liu Shuigao, the man who had previously been imprisoned for violence, took charge of the disposal. He decided on a method that was as practical as it was grotesque. To make the body disappear, they would dismantle it. Using knives and the hammer, Liu Shuigao began the process of dismembering the body in the bathroom. He separated the limbs and the torso to get rid of the soft tissue and internal organs, and to mask the smell of decomposition that would inevitably follow. He decided to cook them. He fired up the stove. He placed the remains into a large pot of water. In a twisted attempt to disguise the smell of boiling human flesh from the neighbors, he added strong aromatics, cassia bark, star anise, and other spices used in braised pork dishes. He turned the kitchen into a house of horrors, the smell of cooking drifting out into the hallway, masking the atrocity occurring inside. While the pot boiled, Liu Shuigao picked up Liu Ying's cell phone. He knew that if she went silent, her family would start looking immediately. He needed to buy time. He composed a text message, trying to mimic her voice. He sent it to the contact listed as sister, unaware that the phone was now in the possession of her brother-in-law. "I have some urgent business to attend to. I will be away for a while. Do not worry." He hit send, believing he had bought them a few days of peace. Once the cooking was done, Liu Shuigao fished the boiled tissue out of the pot. He cut the cooked meat into smaller, unrecognizable pieces. He wrapped these pieces, along with Liu Ying's clothes, her shattered purse, and her personal effects, into small, dense packages. They divided the labor. Li Xiao and Liu Shuigao took the packages and split up. They moved through the city and the surrounding areas, dumping the bags in trash bins, rivers, and remote wastelands. They traveled as far as Shangtan, a neighboring city, to scatter the evidence as widely as possible, hoping to prevent the police from ever assembling the full picture or the full body. By the time they returned to the apartment, they believed they were in the clear. They had the money, the gold, and the body was gone, washed away in the river, or incinerated in a landfill. On November 22nd, 3 days after the murder, they decided it was time to cash in their final chips. They took the blood-stained gold jewelry, the necklace, the bracelets, the earrings, and found a black market fence willing to buy them with no questions asked. They sold the entire lot for 11,500 yuan, or about $1,800. The fence, a middleman looking for a quick profit, immediately resold the gold to other small-time dealers for 13,300 yuan, making a quick profit of nearly $300. In reality, the police later estimated the value of the stolen jewelry to be over 60,000 yuan, nearly 10,000 United States dollars. The killers had butchered a human being for a fraction of what her life's possessions were worth, trading a woman's existence for a few weeks of gambling money. Flush with cash, Li Xiao and Liu Shuigao did not flee the country. They did not go into hiding. They did exactly what sociopaths do. They celebrated. They used the money from Liu Ying's death to fund a debauched spree of drinking, gambling, and visiting prostitutes. They lived like kings in the very city where they had just committed a massacre, confident that their brutal efficiency had erased all traces of their crime. They were wrong. When the police asked them about the pot of meat found during the raid, the pot they had claimed was for pork buns. The killers offered a final, nauseating detail that revealed the depth of their depravity. They admitted that they hadn't just cooked the meat to hide the smell. "We thought it was a waste to throw it all away," one of them mumbled. "We were planning to eat it with our liquor." The investigators stared at them in silence. The line between criminal and monster had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. With the confession secured, the investigation shifted from a frantic search for a missing person to a grim procedural march toward justice. The detectives now had the words of the killers, but the legal system required physical corroboration. In the days following the arrest, The residents of Zhuzhou witnessed a chilling spectacle: the crime scene reenactment. Li Xiao and Liu Shuigao, shackled and surrounded by a phalanx of armed officers, were escorted back to the apartment complex and subsequently to the various disposal sites scattered across the region. Crowds of onlookers gathered behind police tape, whispering and pointing at the two men who had brought such darkness to their community. The killers walked the police through every step of the atrocity. They pointed out the bed where Liu Ying took her last breath. They stood in the kitchen where the gruesome culinary disposal had taken place. They led investigators to the remote riverbanks and desolate waste grounds in Shangtan, where they had discarded the bags containing the unidentifiable fragments of the victim. For the investigators, recovering the remains was a harrowing task. The body had been so thoroughly destroyed, boiled, and scattered that assembling a complete set of remains was impossible. The forensic anthropologists and medical examiners had to work with bone fragments and cooked tissue, a process that was as scientifically difficult as it was emotionally draining. Each recovered piece was a silent testament to the absolute dehumanization Liu Ying had suffered in her final hours. The case moved swiftly through the Chinese legal system, driven by the overwhelming evidence and the high-profile nature of the crime. The brutality of the corpse cooking detail had leaked to the press, sending shock waves of nausea and outrage across the entire nation. The public demanded a swift resolution. They wanted to see the monsters who could commit such an act face the ultimate punishment. On July 23, 2013, 8 months after the murder, the Zhuzhou Intermediate People's Court opened its doors for the trial of Li Xiao and Li Shuigao. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Family members of Liu Ying sat in the gallery, their faces etched with a mixture of profound grief and burning hatred. Journalists from across the province filled the media benches, pens poised to record the final chapter of this macabre saga. The prosecutors wasted no time in laying out the charges: intentional homicide, robbery, and the desecration of a corpse. They painted a picture of two men who were not just desperate, but predatory. They detailed the stalking, the premeditation, the cold calculation of the lure, and the unimaginable cruelty of the disposal. They argued that these were not men who had made a mistake. They were broken, dangerous individuals who had forfeited their right to live in civilized society. However, as the trial unfolded, a stark and disturbing contrast emerged between the two defendants. It was a study in the duality of criminal psychology. Li Xiao, the younger of the two, and the one with the history of theft, appeared broken by the weight of his actions. Throughout the proceedings, he kept his head bowed, unable to meet the eyes of the victim's family. When he spoke, his voice trembled. He expressed deep, seemingly genuine remorse. He admitted that his greed had led him down a path he never intended to travel so far. He acknowledged that no apology could ever bring Li Ying back or heal the wound he had inflicted on her family. "I am a sinner," Li Xiao told the court, tears streaming down his face. "I deserve to die for what I have done. I am sorry." His defense attorney argued that while Li Xiao was guilty, he was the follower, not the mastermind. He had been manipulated by the older, more violent Liu Shuigao. They pleaded for leniency, hoping for a suspended death sentence or life imprisonment based on his cooperation and contrition. But then there was Liu Shuigao. The behavior of the 48-year-old ex-convict in the dock chilled everyone present. Liu Shuigao stood tall, his posture relaxed, his expression one of utter indifference. He did not look like a man facing the death penalty. He looked like a man waiting for a bus. There was no remorse in his eyes, no tremble in his voice. When the prosecutor questioned him about the dismemberment and the cooking of the body, the courtroom held its breath, expecting shame or denial. Instead, Liu Shuigao described the process with the clinical detachment of a butcher discussing a day's work. He spoke clearly and fluently, answering questions with a terrifying rationality. He did not stutter. He did not cry. He simply explained the logistics of how one destroys a human body to avoid detection. At one point, when pressed about the morality of his actions, Liu Shuigao sneered. He seemed to view the proceedings as a nuisance. His attitude suggested that he believed the world owed him something, and that taking Liu Ying's life was simply a transaction he was entitled to make. He showed no empathy for the woman he had killed, nor for the family weeping just a few yards away. The judge, a veteran of the bench, watched Liu Shuigao closely. In the Chinese legal system, attitude and remorse play a significant role in sentencing. A defendant who shows true repentance might be spared the bullet. A defendant who shows contempt for life seals his own fate. Liu Shuigao's defense was practically non-existent. He tried to argue that the killing was accidental, a robbery gone wrong, but the forensic evidence of the hammer blows and the prepared ropes screamed premeditation. His attempts to deflect blame only highlighted his arrogance. He was, in the eyes of the court, a demon in human skin. The contrast between the weeping Li Xiao and the stone-faced Liu Shuigao was the defining image of the trial. One man had realized the enormity of his sin. The other was incapable of feeling it. After hours of deliberation, the court returned to deliver the verdict. The atmosphere in the room was suffocatingly tense. The presiding judge read the statement. The court found that both defendants had conspired to rob and murder Liu Ying. The crime was premeditated. The motive was vile, and the methods used were extremely cruel and abominable. The detail of cooking the victim's remains was cited as a specific aggravating factor, showcasing a total disregard for human dignity and social morality. The judge addressed the arguments for leniency regarding Li Xiao. While the court acknowledged his confession and his remorse, the severity of the crime was simply too great. He had participated in the binding, the killing, and the disposal. Regret, appearing after the fact, could not wash away the blood on his hands. The sin is too deep to be forgiven, the judge declared. The verdict was unanimous and absolute. Death. Liu Shuigao, death. Both men were also stripped of their political rights for life, and all their personal assets were confiscated. The court ordered that they pay compensation to the victim's family, though everyone knew that two penniless ex-convicts could never pay a fraction of what they owed. When the sentence was read, Li Xiao collapsed, sobbing into his hands. He accepted his fate. Liu Shuigao, true to form, remained impassive. He listened to his death sentence with the same bored expression he had worn throughout the trial. It was the final insult to the memory of Liu Ying. Following the mandatory review by the Supreme People's Court, the execution order was signed. On a clear morning in Zhuzhou, the two men were taken from their cells for the last time. They were driven to the execution ground. There were no last-minute reprieves. In accordance with the law of a life for a life, justice was served. The sharp crack of gunshots echoed through the air, ending the lives of Li Xiao and Liu Shuigao, and closing the file on one of the most gruesome cases in the history of Hunan province. The sky over Zhuzhou remained blue. The city continued to bustle, but the shadow of the case lingered. The murder of Liu Ying serves as a terrifying reminder of the predators that lurk in the blind spots of society. It is a cautionary tale that operates on multiple levels. First, it highlights the immense difficulty of reintegration for ex-convicts in a rigid system. Li Xiao and Liu Shuigao were men who had fallen through the cracks, unable or unwilling to find legitimate work due to their records and lack of education. They formed a toxic feedback loop of resentment and desperation. They felt rejected by society, so they decided to prey upon it. This does not excuse their actions, but it provides the grim context for how such monsters are made. They were poor, but as the old Chinese saying goes, one can be poor in money, but must not be poor in ambition or spirit. These men were spiritually bankrupt. They chose the path of ultimate destruction, rather than the struggle of an honest, albeit difficult, life. Second, the case sparked a difficult conversation about the display of wealth. Liu Ying was a victim, and the blame for her murder lies 100% with the men who killed her. However, Criminal psychology experts pointed out that her habit of wearing excessive amounts of gold and carrying large sums of cash made her a high-visibility target. In the animal kingdom, predators look for the brightest, most exposed prey. In the urban jungle, criminals like Li and Liu scan for the same signals. Liu Ying viewed her jewelry as a symbol of her hard work and success, a badge of honor for lifting herself and her family out of poverty. To Li and Liu, that same jewelry was a taunt, a dazzling invitation that triggered their envy and greed. It is a tragic reality that in a world containing desperate and malicious people, modesty can sometimes be a shield. Ultimately, the tragedy of the Zhuzhou cooking case is the sheer senselessness of it. A successful woman, a beloved wife and sister, was erased from the earth for jewelry worth less than $10,000 and a bank account that was empty. She was killed for a fantasy of wealth that the killers never even achieved. The police of Zhuzhou were praised for their rapid work. From the moment the report was filed to the capture of the suspects, only a few days had passed. Their effective use of surveillance technology and undercover operations prevented Li and Liu from fleeing and potentially hurting others. But for the family of Liu Ying, the efficiency of the police was a cold comfort. They were left with only memories and the horrific knowledge of how their loved one spent her final moments. The apartment where the crime took place remained empty for a long time, a silent monument to the horror that occurred within its walls. The neighbors walked past the door quickly, averting their eyes, perhaps still imagining the smell of strange spices wafting into the hallway. Evil exists. It does not always look like a monster in a movie. Sometimes, it looks like two friendly men at a mahjong table, smiling, joking, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That brings us to the end of this harrowing case from Zhuzhou. It is a story that forces us to look at the darkest corners of human nature, where greed can override every instinct of empathy. It is hard to comprehend how someone could go from sharing a game of cards to committing such an atrocity for a handful of gold. If you found this deep dive compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue to bring these forgotten cases to light, and I want to hear from you in the comments below. Considering Li Shao's deep remorse and confession compared to Li Shuigao's absolute coldness, do you think the justice system should have made a distinction between them? Or did they both deserve the death penalty? Let me know your thoughts. Stay safe, and I will see you in the next video.